Welcome. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. If you're joining us live or you're joining us in the recording of this, we're excited to be offering our 10th episode of Everyday Men Profound Conversations. It's a program offered through the Charleston Community of the Mankind Project, and it's a joint effort with the Greater Carolinas Area Chapter of the Mankind Project. The Mankind Project is a worldwide organization that brings men together to learn from one another, to mentor one another, and to discuss topics that are of importance in our communities, and to bridge cultures and the differences that we have, and to bring us together as men. And I'm here and I'm joined by my co-host, Adam McConnell and Jonathan Richardson. And again, like I said, this is our 10th episode, and we are joined by a wonderful guest today, Miss Michelle Mapp. And Michelle is with the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union of South Carolina's Equal Justice Works Law Fellow, sponsored by Alston and Byrd Racial Justice Fund. And Michelle's project focuses on advocating for the passage of a tenant's right to counsel law in South Carolina. And Michelle's career in public service motivates the marrying of her unique community development finance experience with the practice of law to represent community voices and championing public policy for racial and economic justice. Michelle previously worked for 13 years at the South Carolina Community Loan Fund and served as the organization's CEO for 7 years. SCCLF, as it's known, is a nonprofit mission-based lender that has facilitated the development of more than $300 million in community development projects throughout South Carolina. And over the next 2 years, Michelle will work collaboratively to establish the infrastructure to support a statewide housing justice alliance, a tenants' rights campaign, and a civil tenant right to counsel law in South Carolina. And she will engage directly with tenants to address a root cause of poverty in the state by preventing evictions and the repercussions associated with those evictions. And so the title of this interview is Addressing South Carolina's Access to Justice Gap. And that, as I've come to learn, and as one of the reasons we host these conversations, is they are called Everyday Men. And these are topics that I certainly am not an expert on, and that we want to bring to light to our greater community and the world at large, and hopefully create some understanding of what people experience and face. And it's my belief that the more educated I can be, the more of service I can be in this world and in our community by knowing that these things happen. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michelle and welcome her, and allow you to share what you'd like to share, Michelle, and just speak to our audience. And welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. Welcome to the audience. I'm looking forward to having this conversation and being able to share what I've learned about the eviction crisis here in South Carolina, and for us to collectively think through ways that we can engage individually and collectively on this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, because it's a very rich issue. As I've really done my best to dive into the content of this, I asked myself first is what is the tenant right to counsel? When we talk about evictions, and we talk about, and just so I can share a little bit of data with our audience, it's something that surprised me, is that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, that South Carolina faced a long-term housing crisis, having the highest eviction rate in the US, nearly twice that of any other state, according to Princeton University's Eviction Lab. There were more than 162,000 eviction filings in South Carolina in 2019, which is just, I had no idea. Could you speak to that a little bit more about, what is the tenant right to counsel, and how does that relate to those numbers a little bit?
So what we know we have what's known as the South Carolina Access to Justice Commission, and they did a recent gap study to look at the lack of legal representation in South Carolina. And what they found is that in 99.7% of the eviction cases, the tenant is not represented by an attorney. And so it's this unequal balance of power when you walk into the courtroom and the other side has an attorney, and then you, as just the tenant, oftentimes with a legally defensible reason against eviction, walk into a courtroom without an attorney. So a tenant right to counsel, legislation, bills around the country are really just guaranteeing that a tenant in an eviction case has legal representation.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think just for clarity for people, our in our country, you're guaranteed a right to counsel in a criminal case if you can't afford it. You are not guaranteed that right in a civil case. And so what a lot of state legislators are doing they are enacting these tenant right to counsel laws, guaranteeing that in these civil cases, particularly given the critical nature of housing, that tenants would have legal representation in those cases.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that.
Michelle, could you go into a little more detail about why South Carolina is so unique in its statistics? I mean, I know some has to do with state laws, some has to do with the sort of level of poverty that we have in the state and other things, but I didn't know if you could go a little bit deeper into that to give our audience a sense of why it's such a crisis here relative to other places.
Sure. So I think a couple of issues. One, South Carolina has a population of just over 5 million people. So we're like a large city in a lot of other states. So our total state population is just over 5 million. We have about 1.5 million renters in the state. So about 1 out of every, 4 households in South Carolina is a renter household. We have very low density housing in South Carolina. And so if you understand supply and demand, if you have low supply, high demand, you usually have high prices. And so Charleston, for example, has some of the highest cost housing, not just in South Carolina, not just in the South, but in the entire country for a city of its size. And so you combine all of that with a legal environment that allows, a landlord to file for eviction after a tenant's been late for 5 days, a $50 filing fee. The process is easy, if you will, to evict someone. And so it's led to eviction being used oftentimes as a collection tool, less so as an actual legal means to get someone out who's violated, some law or has not paid the rent without cause.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask, and I was a little fuzzy on that. Is what is the benefit of, what's the motive of these evictions happening after 5 days? And it's what you just said. It's more like a collection tool.
Yeah,
Okay.
and some states have done things where simply by extending that amount of time, and so if a tenant is 15 days late as opposed to 5 or 20 days late. And so it's really about understanding pay cycles, understanding people who may have were very tourism heavy, so they're dependent on tips. And so this month I may need 5 weeks in order to make the rent as opposed to 4 weeks. And so some states have done studies and looked at it and seen that if we just allowed people 5 more days or 10 more days before we allow for eviction, then that rate of paying the rent increases. And I think that's the important point here, is that when tenants are represented, landlords are more likely to get paid. And so, we talk about it often from the tenant's perspective, but I do think that it's something that's critical for landlords to recognize as well, is that when tenants have representation, oftentimes then those lawyers help them get access to resources if they truly have a financial situation and they're unable to pay, or if there are other issues or other benefits that would help them be able to stay in that unit. And ultimately, landlords want to get paid, tenants want to have stable housing. And so this is really about figuring out how we all work together to make that happen.
That's wonderful. So it really truly is a mutually beneficial proposition to have the tenant's right to counsel. From what I heard, the data shows that.
Yes.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay.
So what it sounds like, levels of like an eviction doesn't necessarily translate to someone being put out. It's just it's a means to an end. Is that close to close?
Yeah, and so if we, we have a pilot housing court going on in Charleston County right now. And if you go and you sit and you listen to housing court, oftentimes, people automatically think in eviction, someone hasn't paid their rent, but that may not necessarily be the case. Sometimes it may be the case where you and I are roommates. You're on the lease, I'm not on the lease. You moved out for whatever reason, you're gone, but I'm still there. I'm paying the rent, but I'm not on the lease. And so that's where mediation comes into play and say, hey, here's a tenant, someone who's been paying rent, someone who's they're simply not on the lease. What can we do to get them a lease so that they can move forward? Or it may be a situation where I'm living in a unit and the heat goes out. I've called the landlord 3 months in a row and I said, hey, I don't have any heat. I have small children here. And so I take a portion of my rent money and I pay to have a HVAC guy come in and make those actual repairs. And now I'm in a dispute with the landlord on how do we offset my rent from having made this payment on the heat or the water, or, there's a leak. And so oftentimes there's lots of other issues that come into play besides just someone being late on their rent. And again, one side is often represented by an attorney and the other does not have that legal voice at the table with them to help make the case on why they should be allowed to continue to be a tenant.
I see. I know of an experience similar to that. The house just was not. The tenant, the landlord just was not willing to budge on negotiating anything with a person who was coming out of pocket to pay for people coming through to get the heating HVAC service situation taken care of. It was pretty ugly, and I can see how having legal representation would have definitely benefited both sides, actually.
Right.
So let me ask you this: what exactly about the ACLU makes you passionate about working with them? Like, how did you become affiliated with ACLU?
Sure. So my second year of law school, I did an internship with the ACLU. But prior to doing the internship, I had known their longtime legal director, Susan Dunn, and she had actually called me up my first year of law school and said, Michelle, I know you've worked in housing, you're passionate about housing. would you like to do a little research for me? She's like, I've been on a lot of these calls nationally, and there's this movement that's happening around the country called tenant-right to counsel. Would you be willing to do some research on this issue for me? You know, I have all these other cases going on, and I'd like to learn more and like to see, you know, what we might be able to do here in South Carolina. And this was really motivated by the Princeton's eviction lab report that came out in 2016 and named City of North Charleston as the #1 evicting city in the country. City of Columbia was listed as #8 on the list. And so I think a lot of people were trying to get their hands around what is the issue, what's the data, what can be done about it. And so I did some research for Susan and really began to learn about what was happening. The tenant right to counsel movement really started in New York City in 2016. It was a tenant-led movement. They already had a housing court in New York, but the tenants were finding that they were going to the housing court unrepresented and they were losing lots of cases. And so they began to say, would things be different if we had legal representation, and how might we, you know, have some public policy that would help fund that legal representation? And so they went through a whole movement. And so now, you know, City of New York, you're guaranteed a right to counsel. And I think that, you know, the last estimate is that the city saved something like $300 million because all the costs associated with, you know, homelessness and all the other services that come into play when a family is evicted. And so that really got me interested. And so then I did my internship with the ACLU, and I'd known about the Equal Justice Works fellowships. So they're postgraduate fellowships for 2 years after you graduate. Your salary will be paid by the sponsor organization, and you get to work on a specific project. And so I applied in partnership with the ACLU of South Carolina to Equal Justice Works and won this 2-year fellowship. And so my salary for the next 2 years is being paid by a law firm, an international law firm called Alston and Bird, and they have what they call their racial justice fund. And so they're paying my salary out of that while I actually work for the ACLU of South Carolina on this specific project. Which, you know, the ultimate goal is to get legislation passed in South Carolina around tenant right to counsel. And we do already have, I think, you know, in a lot of ways, we're further along than many other states, and that we do already have legislation that was introduced in South Carolina last year. It didn't get very far, it just got to committee. And so now we're really looking to see how do we build that base of advocates, tenants, landlords, you know, attorneys who all think that this is a win-win, and to convince our legislators that it's an important tool in the toolbox for South Carolina. But I think recognizing that it is just one tool in a toolbox, we need affordable housing, you know, and we can have a whole nother conversation on just the need for affordable housing. This is really just saying that while we're working on the affordable housing issue, let's try to keep people in their houses, you know, so we can stem that tide of evictions while we tackle these other housing policy issues. I think that that'll be the goal.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I mean, it's great to be leading in things in our country, but a couple of things we're leading in here in Charleston is the highest cost of housing and number of evictions in the United States. And so that needs to change. How long does it take to get just for somebody like me who doesn't really know that process? Can you explain that in like a layman's term? Like you said, it only went to committee, and you got 2 years here. Like, is that like realistic to think that some legislation could get passed in a couple years, or does it take longer? Or
So, I think that I've seen legislation. So for example, in Maryland last year, they introduced the tenant-right to counsel bill, and they got it passed through the Maryland state legislature in 90 days. But very different political environment than maybe South Carolina. I really think ultimately it's about being able to tell the story. And there's a human side to the story, but there's also an economic side to the story. And I think here in South Carolina, oftentimes we're able to move the needle when we can show sort of the dollars and cents of an issue. And so one of the first things that we will be doing is commissioning an economic analysis study. So what is the cost of all of these evictions in South Carolina? So, as we know, 160 some odd thousand people were evicted in 2019 in South Carolina. What was the cost to the state? What was the cost to local government of that level of people being evicted? And how much would we save by maybe investing in tenant-right to counsel as an alternative to keep people in their house? And so we want to be able to quantify that number so then we can talk real dollars and cents with legislators about what this means. But I think we also have to think about what does it mean in terms of, yeah, there's the dollars and cents, but what does it mean to a 7-year-old child who's sitting in a classroom knowing, hey, today's Friday, hey, today's the end of the month, I'm going home and, I don't know if I'm going to be back in school on Monday because I don't know whether we're going to still, have a roof over our head. And so I think that there's a lot of sort of intangible costs to evictions and its impact more broadly on communities, on our educational system, on our criminal justice system. We know already from looking at the data where evictions are the highest in our state is also where we have some of our highest crime rates as well. And so what's the correlation between the two? We also know that evictions tend to be a cycle. And so once someone is evicted, that's an impact on their ability to rent again, on their, oftentimes it has an impact on their credit. And so it sort of puts people in a cycle. And so even though I may have gotten a new job and I'm being paid more and I can afford, but I now have this eviction on my record. And so every place I'm going to try to rent, they're telling me no, or, I now, something's been reported on my credit report. And so, hey, maybe I've been able to find a place, but I need to get a car and I'm having challenges getting a car to be able to get to work. So it becomes this whole sort of vicious cycle of eviction. And I would highly recommend that people who want to understand sort of the human side of the issue read Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, which really sort of puts a face and a name to the issue and tells the story of what happens to a family, what happens to children when their parents go through this cycle of eviction.
Thank you for that. Go ahead.
Yeah, Michelle, that really spoke to me a bit because when I was younger, housing instability was something that I experienced a bit. And there were times when at the end of the month, my mom would say, hey, put up all your stuff and put it in this bag. Here's your trash bag, throw your clothes in it. We're getting in the car and we got to move, and really unexpectedly. And so, and I don't know all the details of that. I do know that my mother did the best she could with the tools she had at the time and was really just trying to keep a roof over our heads and food in our bellies, right? Like that's what was going on there. But I've experienced that personally. And so like what you said, really, does touch me a bit. And I'm wondering, you talk about the humanness, but the law itself is really inhumane, right? Like the law itself is basically, we have property rights, we have these contracts called leases, right? And like, that's what the courts see. And as a broader community, there's a lot of other biases that are built in, right? Like our tax code, for instance. Our tax code is biased towards homeowners, right? You pay half the taxes that you would if you have a property that you rent. That cost gets pushed on to renters, right? And so there's a broader sort of problem with the way in which our complete economic system's really lined up for that in a way.
Yeah.
What my question for you there is, are there other first, can you bring humaneness to the law? And if not, what other policies can we implement from a municipal, county, or state level that will allow us to sort of soften the cruelty of our current housing crisis?
Yeah, and so I think that's a very valid point, and one in which just sort of given my background and how I got to law school was really to that very point. And having worked for 13 years for this organization that was financing affordable housing, and while we did really great work, very quickly realized that money was never going to be enough. That if we had all the money in the world, as you said, we've created sort of systems and built biases into the system that favor home ownership over renter, for example, in our tax code. From a planning and zoning perspective, we in the Southeast, for whatever reason, we're very anti-density. And I understand, sort of from the environmental and the beauty of this place that people want to be able to preserve that. But there is a human toll and a cost to having sort of this anti-density sentiment and sort of building in a lack of supply into the system. And so I could sit down and probably name, 10 public policies that I think need to change at the state level. And I see tenant-right to counsel as being the first of a much broader housing justice, housing public policy platform that we would hope to enact here in South Carolina. Like I said, this is just to stop the bleeding, to keep people in their houses. I am a fan, I think people who know me, of inclusionary zoning. I think that there are examples around the country where it's being, Alexandria, Virginia is one of the places that comes to mind where I believe that it's being done successfly.
Can you explain what that, Michelle, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you explain what that is you and I know, I think, but I'm not sure that our broader audience know what inclusionary.
Yeah, that intrigued me, that just the sound of that.
Yeah, so inclusionary zoning. So zoning most often is exclusionary, and so I have this area of land, and I'm going to tell you that you can only build X, Y, and Z on this land, and all these other uses and things are excluded. And I may tell you that you can build houses on this land, but they can only be on 1 acre lots. And so there's a cost to all of that. And that exclusionary nature of our zoning excludes people. And if you look back at the legal history of zoning, you will find that oftentimes, those exclusions had less to do with, oh, I don't want to have a pig farm next to my business, and more often to do with, I don't want to have those people living next to me. And so understanding that that is the base, the legal base of our planning and zoning laws, inclusionary zoning just says that when we're going to build, when we're going to zone, when we're going to, have permissive uses, then we're gonna zone to include housing for everyone. And so we're really looking at sort of having cookie cutter neighborhoods, for example, really thinking about things like income levels. And so I'm going to create a neighborhood where, you know, there's people of diverse income levels who can afford to live in this area. And what we know from a community building standpoint, when people are allowed to sort of work and live and play all together, it helps to form this cohesiveness in a community and where people are able to move up and down the ladder. So maybe, you know, for example, me and my husband, and we had our 2 kids, and we needed a lot of space, you know. Now it's just me and my husband, you know, and so it probably makes sense for us to downsize, but we really like the area we live in. We want to be able to stay in that area. We want to be able to afford to stay in that area. And so it's really about thinking about sort of the life cycle of families, of individuals, and creating these inclusive communities, and sort of what are the laws that need to be enacted so that developers can do that. I often, you know, hear people, the big bad developer is sort of, you know, the mantra that we often hear. But if you really spend any time in development and with the development community, you quickly realize that permission to be able to be creative, permission to be able to, you know, build at different income levels is a challenge in a lot of communities. And so there's lots that we need to do, I think, from a public policy perspective to enable the development of communities in a way that's going to be most beneficial to all of us. And so I see tenant right to counsel as just being the first of a lot for me, a new legal career.
Yeah, I like the way you put it, just to kind of stop the bleeding and then focus on some other things. And to me, it seems like, developers are the easy target, especially in Charleston, where you see these high rises going up. And I really like that you say that might not be the target that we want to aim for, but it's some other policies and things within government and municipalities that we need to look at. And I wanted to shift gears a little bit. We can leave the quantifying the data for as you push this through legislation. And I want to talk a little bit more about the human cost and the human impact of this, the emotional impact of this. How, Adam pre our show spoke to a little bit about that, which really touched my heart, and the impact of him, as he shared, putting his stuff in a plastic bag and what that did to him and his outlook on life. And for me, just thinking about our audience and getting them engaged, and how as the Mankind Project, one of our tenants is bringing community together, creating more understanding within the community so that we can all rise together and support one another. I think people listening and watching this may, if we can appeal to the heart side for a little bit, for, a little while longer in this and go into that. And I know that that's something that we had talked about a little bit, but the broader implications of eviction and the cyclical nature of it. Does anybody have, Adam, Jonathan, or Michelle, anybody want to just speak to that, or anything come up for you around that we could share with the audience, just to touch on that, and maybe increase compassion a little bit for people who might be in that cycle. And if you're a renter, a landlord, maybe you could see it differently, and we could put that out there, because maybe there's landlords watching this that are a little bit fed up and they're not quite seeing this as a whole. So
I just wanted to put something in perspective for me. With the number of evictions, it was 162,000. So I was doing pulled out my calculator, and at $50 a pop per process, that's only $8 million the state made off of having such a profound effect on 162,000 different households. You know, that, so my mind is there. You know, there's so many different ways that all of those situations could have been avoided. However that looks, but definitely just the generational process, the generational trauma that just one of those evictions costs for children. And we're only looking at a number of $8 million. You know, it's a lot of money, but I guess from a statewide perspective, you know, I don't know the answer to this, or I don't even know how we can wrap our heads around that. But how else can we avoid such gaps, if I may? You know, because it's 162,000 different families that was affected at $50 per eviction notice.
Right, and then the 8 million seems to pale in comparison to if a family is evicted, what are the social impacts, and then what are the costs? And I know reading through this, you know, the state can reduce the social safety costs significantly. So that 8 million, like I think what I'm hearing you say, Jonathan, kind of pales in comparison to what we're paying to help those families rebound and come back. And then also this is the emotional, you know, kind of the psycho-emotional aspect on impact on the children and the mothers and fathers.
Yeah, I mean, I myself was fortunate enough. Well, I did spend some time in a homeless shelter and living, you know, from a couple of different people's couches just within my recent past. It wasn't necessarily in my childhood. You know, there was a whole nother set of trauma that I experienced then, but just in my adult life, just from, you know, circumstances. Yes, I spent some time homeless, and I was fortunate enough not to have it have any profound effects on my children. They, you know, they saw me, they knew what was going on, but you know, they wasn't totally they shared a different experience from other kids who lived with their parents, who had to go through housing insecurity. So I'm grateful for that. And I kind of lost my train of thought, but yeah, I just wanted to share that as well. You know, there's many different ways that families can be affected, and this conversation is pretty much only tipping the iceberg, only barely tipping the iceberg, you know.
The last week of October, there was the headlines in one of the papers around the state was a tsunami of families were showing up at homeless shelters with children. You know, I do think we have to talk about how the pandemic, in my mind, sort of muddies the water in the eviction moratoriums, because I do think that some folks will say, well, it was just the pandemic and the moratoriums. But I think, to your point, highlighting the fact that that 162,000 eviction was for 2019. So that was pre-pandemic, that was our level. And although we haven't risen back to that level of evictions because there was a moratorium in place, you know, we do need to be cognizant that those numbers are beginning to increase. And I think part of the challenge is that, you know, we've always had what we call the working poor. We've always had people who are getting up every single day, going to work, but they just don't make enough to be able to afford the average 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom house in our community. And so we know for a fact that there are families who are spending 50, 60, 70% of their monthly income on housing. It only takes one thing to happen, you know, to need
Yep.
some new tires, for the radiator to go out, for the HVAC to go out, for a kid to get sick, for a pandemic to happen, to throw you into this cycle where you're no longer able to take 70% of your income and put it towards rent and not be able to eat or go to the doctor or do all the other things. And so I think, as Adam said in an earlier, it feels intractable because there's so many different pieces to the puzzle. There's a whole discussion we can have about wages. There's a whole discussion we can have about affordable housing. There's a whole discussion we can have about public policy and zoning and those things. I think what's important in the takeaway is that thinking through how we come together collectively within the state to say, these are issues that we care about. These issues matter. These are issues we're going to vote about. And that's really what my job is over the next 2 years, is sort of figuring out, and for me, beyond the 2 years, but figuring out how we build a coalition of folks in this state, 1.5 million renters who care about these issues and who say, we believe, although it feels intractable, that we can change these things. And it's going to take time, and we're going to have to be strategic in thinking about, if tenant right to counsel comes first, what comes next and what comes after that, but that we believe that collectively we can change these things, that we believe that we are electing people who care about these issues and want to see that these issues change. And I believe that, and I have faith in that. As I was sharing yesterday with someone, I am a 52-year-old African-American woman in Charleston who just graduated from law school and passed the bar. I believe things are possible. And so taking that same faith and belief and saying, how do we collectively come together and work and do the hard work and have the profound and hard conversations that need to be had to figure out, how do we change these systems? How do we change this state that's leading the case, the country in eviction, and believing that we have the ability to do that. And I think that that's a large part of it, is just that confidence that we believe that we can do this.
Michelle, I think it goes to a point I think I shared with you before, but it seems like we make housing for profits, not for people, right? I mean, that's fundamentally what it is. And there's an economic reality to development, as you know better than us, because you did it for a number of years. And I don't know how to say this without sounding too, I think it's important that we don't neglect. You do a really good job of avoiding the term race, but I think that especially here in Charleston, like, there's a very strong underlying racial component to those conversations that is like really, really, really hard to engage with. And I'm wondering how, and I think it's something the whole country's struggling with, right? How do we have these conversations in a way that doesn't alienate people, that allows us to come together, that allows us to build spaces and cities and communities that are supportive of one another, rather than sort of just for, I got mine and, let's put up a gate and no one else is coming in, like, how, I don't know if you probably don't have an answer for that, but do you have any insight or thoughts about that, about how we could like sort of broaden that perspective, sort of overcome some of those racial biases, and then kind of how do we, you said elect people to office who like will support these things. That's pretty hard to do, right? But how do you make that movement happen? Do you have any suggestions there?
Yeah. So I do think that we have to acknowledge that in South Carolina, the face of poverty is a Black face. And so oftentimes when we talk about issues of poverty, there is that sort of, there's a lot of stigmas around those people, you know, the whole sort of welfare queen, you know, wanting something for nothing. You know, we have to be honest that all of those stigmas exist and those conversations are had. But I also think that the data nerd in me is like, but we also have to ground all of those sort of assumptions in real data. And so one of the surprising things is that nationally, if you look at the data, the population most impacted by evictions are African-American women, overwhelmingly.
Mhm.
South Carolina is one of 5 states where it's not, that there are more white people being evicted in South Carolina than there are Black people, and that sort of face of eviction in South Carolina. And so I was actually on a call with some folks earlier this week who were like trying to dig into and said, you know, we expected the data to be, you know, the same in South Carolina as other places. Why is that? And trying to figure out, you know, what's going on. And, you know, I mean, I can clearly tell you that, you know, Charleston in a lot of ways, its housing sort of situation mirrors that of San Francisco in the same way, you know, that the face of who's being evicted in San Francisco is clearly not an African-American woman. It's not going to be in Charleston either. We have a really high cost housing market, and its impact is not just, you know, on poor people, you know what I mean? And so I think helping people to understand sort of the dynamics of what's happening with our housing market. But I say all that to say is that race is critically important to this conversation, but also the recognition, I think, as we see in our country now, where we're having these conversations about critical race theory and about banning books and, you know, all of this stuff that, you know, just maybe 2 years ago, we would have been like, what? You know, race can be very divisive in terms of public policy and trying to move public policy. And so it's not that I'm ignoring the issue of race because it undergirds everything. I'm saying, in spite of the racial issues, we have a problem. We have an eviction problem. How do we collectively address that problem, knowing that the impact of our work, there's going to be racial repercussions to that. And so, like I learned, you know, doing this work, that sometimes the hardest thing is to get people into the room to have the conversation. And when you recognize what those triggers may be that prevents people from coming into the room, sometimes maybe you don't lead with those triggers. Sometimes it's more important to get everybody in the room together first, get a common base in understanding, and then once we've realized that, hey, we have some commonalities here and there's things that we can agree on, then we've created a relationship and a foundation upon which we can have the hard conversations about race, about gender, you know, about poverty. But I think so often what happens is that we lead with the hard stuff. Everybody goes to their corner. Nobody wants to meet in the middle of the ring to try to hash it all out. and we never move forward. And people are hurting, and I want us to move forward. And so figuring out how we navigate that and how we do that so that we can move forward. And then I think, also recognizing, I think, to your point about political office, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in our state around voting, around access to voting. Through my travels in the state, I've heard some horror stories, things that you're thinking like, are we in 1950 here in terms of just access to be able to vote? And I think for me, part of the attraction of the ACLU is that there's the sort of policy and advocacy work of the ACLU, but there's also the litigation work of the ACLU and being able to use the law to challenge some of these systems and figuring out in what areas it makes sense. For some areas, litigation makes sense. You're going to have to sort of force the system to change. And other areas, advocacy makes sense. And so really understanding those nuances and differences. And I think building sort of the coalition or base of folks so that then the issue today might be right to counsel. Tomorrow, it might be the Voting Rights Act. Next year, it might be police reform. But right now, we sort of lack that base or coalition of folks who have been able to come together around these issues, sort of build the infrastructure of what that looks like. How do we engage with folks? How do we call people to action? There's a lot of sort of nuts and bolts work that still needs to happen here in South Carolina on the ground to sort of build, I think, a coalition of folks. I call us the silent majority. I think that, the people who are unhappy with something tend to be the most vocal, but I think there's a silent majority of people in this country who, want people to have the ability to vote, who want people to have access to safe, decent, stable housing, who don't hate the police, but believe that the police should be held accountable just like everyone else if they break the law. I think that most people in this country, I believe, are reasonable and have reasonable thoughts about these issues, believe that everyone's entitled to due process of law, who believe that it's an imbalance of power for 99.7% of tenants to show up in court without legal representation. And so I think figuring out how we get the reasonable silent majority to exercise their right to vote, to use their voice, to come together collectively to change these systems is really the work that I'm committed to doing.
That's fantastic.
Thank
Thank you. Well,
Michelle, your comment about how we come together, have those conversations was really beautiful and inspiring to me. So I just thank you for that. That was really a great perspective for me to hold and sit with for a little bit. So thank you for that.
And I think a wonderful way to begin to wrap this up and bring this home. We have a few more minutes here, and just in the discussion of, if we have between 100 people watching this and 1,000 people watching this, and they are intrigued with this conversation, we discussed a few different ways that people can get involved or begin to realize that this is a much more common problem than they may understand, and maybe that brings them some relief and a desire to move forward. But in wrapping this up, and our takeaways, you spoke to our takeaways a little bit. Is there any way, and I know that you had discussed and you shared with us behind the scenes a little bit that people can go to the Princeton's Eviction Lab online. Princeton's Eviction Lab online, and to really understand the extent of the eviction crisis in America, and to become more aware and educated on what's going on is one aspect. Would you be willing, Michelle, before we close here, just to speak to any other way in your mind that people can get involved with this conversation, perhaps voting, in developing this coalition that you speak of?
Yeah, I would encourage folks to go to the ACLU of South Carolina website to join our mailing list. We are about to launch a newsletter that's a monthly newsletter that's specific to this issue, tenant right to counsel. It'll have lots of links to sort of the data, what other folks are doing around the country. And so anyone who wants to learn more about the issue, that newsletter will be going out. So I encourage you to go to the ACLU of South Carolina website and join our newsletter, and so that you'll be informed. And then over the next few months, we're going to launch this coalition of folks. We are going to commission this study. We think it'll take about 6 months to get the final results. And so, happy to come back after we get that and, maybe share with you all that. And just really, I think, ultimately, register the vote, vote in every single election, take somebody with you when you go to vote. But I really think that we have to, be committed to systems change. And that starts for me at the ballot box. And then I think figuring out ways that we can encourage people to run for elected office. I'm a firm believer that you don't have to be an elected official to run or to change systems. But I do think that, it is a powerful mechanism for change. And I think that there are really great people who want to run for elected office, who desire to make those changes. And I think figuring out how we support them, how we encourage them, people who the reasonable people, as I call them, that silent majority, as people arise from that group and want to make change, how do we collectively get behind them and support them? I think it is critical as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right. Well, Adam, Jonathan, any last thoughts that you have that you want to share? Or?
Coming from my experience, I had very little knowledge of what the type of work you're doing. I'm so grateful that someone out there will benefit from it. I'm more than grateful, more than humble to be here, part of this conversation. I wanted to kind of see if there was some type of connection between evictions and gentrification, but I cover that in another topic. I just can't help but to think of that. Living in North Charleston for about 6 years, I was between Remount Road and Dorchester, that whole area there. Every time and periodically I'll drive through there just for one reason or another, and I will notice that there are new things being put up, of sorts. But just getting back to how grateful I am to know that you're putting in this work, it means a lot to me personally, and I just want to thank you, like, wholeheartedly. Thank you for doing what you're doing. It's so needed. It's so needed.
I'll second that as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Jonathan and Adam, for sharing your personal stories. I appreciate you all trusting us with your stories. And what I will say is that eviction is a tool of gentrification. And we could have a whole conversation about the ways in which leases are not being renewed, and then an eviction follows that non-lease renewal. So then a landlord can either sell their building or be able to lease to a new crop of tenants. And so that is a whole conversation we can have about how the eviction crisis, particularly in North Charleston, is very much related to gentrification in some areas.
Absolutely.
It is certainly such a broad-reaching topic here. This hour has gone by very quickly. On behalf of my co-host, Adam McConnell, Jonathan Richardson, Michelle, we thank you so much for joining us this morning. And if anybody out there, any men watching this, enjoys these types of conversations and wants to engage with this community of men here in Charleston that cares deeply about our community and the world at large, reach out to me or either Adam or Jonathan at any time. We'd love to have you jump on board with us. So thank you all, our audience, for watching today. We're grateful for each of you, because without you, this would not be possible. And we hope that you go out there and do good work and take care of one another. So for today, thank you.
Thank you.